Good afternoon. I'm Professor Shane Dark, and welcome to the weekly NDART webinar broadcast live, as always, from the ballrooms of Mars, which viewers would know as the birthplace of Andersonian realism. While we are widely dispersed, we acknowledge traditional owners of country throughout Australia, recognise the continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, it's a real pleasure today to have my colleague and friend on to speak, Professor Don Weatherburn. Don's one of the world's leading experts on criminality and criminal law enforcement. Before coming to us at NDART, Don will be well known to many people as the Executive Director of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research for 31 years. He's published on a wide range of topics, including sentencing, criminal justice admin, drug law enforcement, of relevance to alcohol-related violence, harm reduction and program evaluation. He's also been an author on more than 200 publications, including 4 books, and his last book, the intriguingly titled The Vanishing Criminal, was published last year by Melbourne University Press. Now, look, the issue that Don's going to address today, alcohol-related violence, is one of the very highest importance to our society. And over the decades, governments have responded in a variety of different ways to deal with this problem. So in this presentation, Don's going to explore one such intervention that was very high profile, the New South Wales lockout laws, and looking at its role in this, whether it displaced assault to other areas surrounding King's Cross and the CBD. It's going to tell us the circumstances that led up to the introduction of these laws and their long-term impact on assaults in King's Cross and surrounding areas. We'll move on then to discuss the implications more broadly for liquor licensing policy. And as always, for full details, I direct you to Don's publications. And I'm also delighted that we'll be joined in Q&A by Professor Michael Farrow, who's the director of NDART, and we're known to many, if not all of you, who provide from his extensive clinical and research expertise on this topic. Now, you can ask your questions in the Q&A function. Please not chat on the Q&A, and I'll present them to the panel at the end of the presentation. I may not be able to ask all of them, but I'll most certainly endeavour to do so. So with no more from me, now, Don, it's over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Shane, and it's a pleasure to be talking about this topic. Let me, though, start at the very beginning of this. It's always a good place to start. The setting for this study is King's Cross and Sydney CBD around the year 2000. The annual visitor population at that time was about 5.3 million. It happened to have, the whole Sydney region had an alcohol-related assault rate that was 4 times New South Wales as a whole. But what really got people going was the fact that rates of alcohol-related violence were rising rapidly. This next graph shows you the increase in alcohol-related assaults reported to police over that time period. So between 2000 and 2008, the rate of assault actually doubled. Now, needless to say, this attracted a lot of media attention. This is the typical thing you'd see on the TV screens during that time, some poor intoxicated soul lying on the footpath and a bunch of police are around. If it wasn't that, it was usually some group of people fighting after drinking way too much. But it wasn't just the police or the media that got in on the act. The Prime Minister declared the abuse of alcohol was an epidemic. The Sydney Morning Herald declared there were too many watering holes and too many louts. The police chiefs called for a war on drugs. And of course, there were just endless stories about the trouble caused by alcohol-related violence. Now, the government decided to act, then Labor government. In July 1, it gave itself new powers to declare lockouts and curfews. In October 30, it introduced a freeze on new 24-hour liquor licence permits and declared that no alcohol could be sold between 4 a.m. and 10 p.m. when most of us were in bed. In December 30, 2008, special conditions were imposed on the most violent 48 premises, including a mandatory 2 a.m. lockout, no glass containers because people getting drunk used to use these as weapons, no containers after night, no shots after midnight, and 10-minute timeouts every hour. Now, it's often forgotten that these initiatives had quite a substantial effect on assault. When we evaluated the effects, we found that actual bodily harm had declined by 32%, and grievous bodily harm, which is a more serious form of assault, had declined by about 40%. And you can see this quite obviously in the graphs, which I'm going to show you now. This graph shows the trend in assault occasioning actual bodily harm over New South Wales during that period. And you can see that it was climbing through the late 90s up to 2008, and then did an abrupt turnaround and started coming down. The picture is even clearer in the case of assault occasioning grievous bodily harm. You can see that steep rise followed by a very abrupt decline. But as with all of these things, it was too late for some and too late for the then Labor government. And in April 2011, the Labor government actually lost the state election, and the incoming National Liberal government was elected and immediately rejected lockouts and early closing times, promising instead a 3 strikes and you're out scheme, tougher policing, and cultural change, whatever that is. Everything went quiet for about a month. And then, of course, we had the first of 2 fatal assaults. Thomas Kelly was killed in an alcohol-related one-punch assault in King's Cross. And while everybody was recovering from the shock of that, only a few months later in December 2013, Daniel Christie was killed in an alcohol-related one-punch assault in almost exactly the same location. Well, the new government did an about-face and announced sweeping changes to tackle alcohol-fueled violence in Sydney. It began by declaring 2 new areas, known respectively as the King's Cross and Sydney CBD entertainment precincts. And I'll just show you what they are. I don't know whether, is my cursor visible? I hope it's visible. But if it's not, that yellow area there, or what to this colourblind person thinks is a yellow area, is the Sydney CBD entertainment precinct. And the smaller reddish area off to the right is the King's Cross entertainment precinct. So what the government did in those precincts was introduce a whole range of restrictions. A 1:30 a.m. lockout at pubs, bars, registered clubs, nightclubs and karaoke bars. A 3 a.m. cessation of alcohol service in all venues. A prohibition on the granting of any new liquor licences in these areas. And a ban on takeaway alcohol sales across New South Wales as a whole after the 10 p.m. lockout. Well, of course, nothing that researchers like more than a natural experiment. And so a bunch of us climbed in to find out what effect this all had. And the general rule is that most studies found that the lockout laws resulted in a substantial drop in assault. They also, these earlier studies, found little evidence of displacement. The only exception was one that I conducted with my colleagues, Neil Donnelly and Suzanne Poynton, where we had a look at what happened to the Star City Casino. There was a bit of a jump in assault there, not enough to offset the reduction occurring elsewhere, but still a jump, which left open the question of why the Star City Casino had been left out of the CBD entertainment precinct. Now, good though these studies were, they suffered from a number of weaknesses, including my own. First of all, because everyone went in so early, they had limited follow-up times, and that's a problem because it does take time for displacement to occur. Particularly when you're talking about licensed premises. Someone who had a pub, for example, in King's Cross would have had to buy a new place over in some area, someplace outside the precincts and get a license. There's no test for structural break. In other words, everybody just assumed the lockout laws were the starting point for the decline in assaults. That may not have been true, and there's a reason for that. If you have a look at this graph, this shows you a monthly count of news coverage on alcohol-related violence in the period leading up to the lockout laws and thereafter. And you can see there was a big spike at the death of Thomas Kelly and an even bigger one at the death of Daniel Christie. And either one of those could have been the starting point for the drop of assault. And that's important because we always want to distinguish between the effects of policy and the effects of publicity, if you like, surrounding that policy. Anyway, the third problem was that the counterfactual in most studies, that is the means by which we judge whether an effect had occurred, was an extension of the CBD and King's Cross entertainment precincts. In other words, we just took the trends, extrapolated them out, and looked at the difference between what we saw and what we thought we would have seen had the lockout laws but not been enacted. Now, the problem with that is that the trends in those 2 areas, King's Cross and the Sydney CBD, may not have followed their pre-existing trend. They could have followed that for the rest of New South Wales. And in some ways, that's a more plausible scenario. So what did we do? Well, we defined 6 areas of interest, the King's Cross and Sydney CBD entertainment precincts, of course. Then 2 new areas, the proximal displacement area and the distal displacement area. And those were the areas where we thought people might go if they couldn't get a drink in King's Cross or the Sydney CBD. We also included the rest of New South Wales and another area I won't talk much about called the affected zone, which is really just the combination of King's Cross and Sydney CBD, because a couple of people thought that we'd misallocated assaults that should have belonged to King's Cross and placed them in the CBD, and get around that problem by joining the two up and seeing what happened. Okay, so here are the precincts I've just described to you. The blue or purple area, again, I'm revealing my colour blindness, that is the Sydney CBD entertainment precinct. The little red spot is King's Cross. The yellow is where we thought drinkers might go if they couldn't get a drink in that area. But they're not the only options. It's a short cab drive to either Newtown, Coogee, Bondi Beach and Double Bay. And those are all popular drinking spots in or near the Sydney CBD. So what we did was we used structural break analysis to identify the change point. We used time series analysis to detect changes in the level or slope of the assault series in those areas, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. We used the rest of New South Wales as our control instead of just using an extrapolation of the pre-existing trends in King's Cross and the Sydney CBD. And the data we're talking about are monthly counts of police recorded non-domestic assaults between January 2009 and March 2021. Okay, so I know some people don't like equations, so I'm just going to give you a visual picture of what we're looking for. There are two ways in which the lockout or the death of Daniel Christie might have influenced. The first we call a level effect, and you can see that we've got a pre-existing trend coming down before the lockout, and then in this schematic diagram there's a sudden drop. The alternative is what's called a change in the slope, and that's on the right-hand side, and you can see that what happens is, although there's a pre-existing downward trend, it accelerates afterwards. So that's the kind of thing we are looking for. Now this next slide is for Nikki. She loves an equation far more than a picture. And just to help you out here, that little term there, alpha 0, captures the change in level after the intervention. That one there captures the change in the slope after the intervention. This one here captures any general statewide downward trend. And that one there controls for the seasonal effects, because as some of you know, assaults are much more common in summer than they are in winter. Now, Nikki, probably alone amongst all of you, is wondering what about BO and B1, the two B2s? Well, they just capture the pre-existing trend before the intervention and the slope after the intervention. There's only one more equation. We can skip straight through it, but you know, I've really got to look after Nikki in this presentation. Okay, what about displacement? Well, this is what I mean by displacement. Nothing could be worse, we think, than to have a downward trend in King's Cross and the CBD accelerating, while in the PDA or the DDA, those displacement areas, have it going up. What we really want to see is something like that, where the control group shows no change and we just get the acceleration in the downward trend. Now, here's the next slide for Nikki. Nikki, we capture that just from those two terms we've added to the general equation, one of which captures displacement from King's Cross and the other one displacement from the CBD. That's enough equations for anybody. Okay, what are the results? Well, first of all, the structural break did turn out to be the month before the lockout. It was month 61. This is the month that Daniel Christie was tragically killed. Before we get into the stats, it's good to actually have a look at the graph. So what you've got here at the top left-hand side is you've got the trend in recorded assaults for King's Cross. And you can see what seems to be happening here is not only a change in the level, but also a change in the slope. It seems to accelerate straight after the end of the lockout and then drop slowly away from that. If you look across at the CBD, it looks like it just dropped. No real change in the slope there. But of course, if you look at the PDA, which is that middle one on the left, you can see something which would be worrying for anybody. It's going up after the lockout zone. In the affected zone, no big surprises there. It's what you'd expect combining the CBD and King's Cross. The DDA is so noisy, it's really hard to tell what's going on. And the rest of New South Wales, which you wouldn't expect to be affected by the lockout, wasn't really affected, except that it leveled out. Now, for those of you who like the stats, this next slide does it. I'll go through it quite slowly so you get the picture. But on the left-hand side, that left-hand column, don't worry about the intercept. The time trend, that just shows you what was happening to the trend in assaults before the intervention. A negative sign indicates that it was dropping. So it was dropping in King's Cross. Then we got a level break and a trend break. Just what we thought would happen, happened. You've got a sudden drop in the level and you've got an acceleration of the downward trend. So everything happened in King's Cross just the way you'd think it would happen. There's no trend, nothing in New South Wales or displacement. Moving to the CBD, you've got your level break, a big drop there, but no trend break. The rest of New South Wales is significant, which means that it's contributing to the downward trend in the CBD. Over there at the PDA, you can see that it was actually going up because it's positive before the lockout took effect. The rest of New South Wales made a bit of a contribution, second from the bottom there. And lo and behold, we've got displacement down the bottom. If you look across the affected zone, no real surprises there. You've got a big effect on the level break, largely because the Sydney CBD is much bigger than King's Cross and has lots more assaults. And you've got a contribution from the rest of New South Wales, and nothing of interest really happened in the distal displacement area. Now, for those of you who prefer a summary, this is really what happened. The lockout and the death of Daniel Christie, we can't tease them apart, are associated with a 22% fall in assault in the King's Cross precinct, a 33% fall in assault in the CBD precinct, but every drop of 10 assaults in King's Cross resulted in a 2.8%, in an additional 2.8 assaults in the proximal displacement area. Well, you might think everybody'd be happy, but they weren't. Alan Jones declared, actually the Empire struck back, he declared that the place had turned into a morgue, but he was hardly alone. These headlines here give you some picture of the level of discontent. The Daily Mail declaring that Sydney will never recover from the ridiculous lockout laws that have destroyed the city's nightlife. We've got lockout laws destroying the culture of King's Cross, according to hotelier Bruce Solomon. Well, he would say that, I guess. We've got blistering attacks and so on and so forth. But it wasn't just the general media community that were responding to this. We also had a big response from industry. So we had the Keep Sydney Open political party formed to lobby for change to the liquor licensing laws. We had them holding mass rallies in February and October, which I think from memory, were very well attended. The Australian Hotels Association called for the removal of blanket lockout laws. The Retail Traders Association said that the lockout laws had virtually destroyed Sydney nightlife. Music Australia claimed a 40% reduction in live music revenue in Sydney. Well, if that isn't political pressure, I don't know what is. But what was the public thinking? Well, this graph here, it takes you from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, and it shows you the trend in the percentage of Australians who supported or strongly supported fewer trading hours, that's the bottom curve, or restricted late night trading. And you can see what happened between 2004 and 2010 or 13. There was a big increase in support for restricted trading hours and fewer trading hours, but then declined very rapidly after 2013. So you can see what's going on here is a big and successful public health policy is producing a very big community backlash because of the other costs associated with it. Well, what was the government response? Well, nobody would be surprised if the government was hurt by this reaction to its successful public health measure. So they announced an independent review of lockout laws by the High Court Judge Callanan. He came back recommending that they relax the 1:30 and 3 a.m. last drinks measures, put it to 2 p.m. and 3:30 p.m, extend the takeaway alcohol time from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m, and extend home delivery to alcohol from 10 p.m. to midnight, which Shane Darke was extremely happy about, I should say. What was the government response to Callanan? Okay, we'll do all that and more. They introduced all those recommendations and extended the liquor license freeze. They increased the small bar patron capacity from 60 to 100 and allowed trading in those small bars to go till 2 a.m. in the Sydney CBD and King's Cross. They retained the mandatory ID scanners and they strengthened the 3 strikes disciplinary scheme. I don't think that was enough. The evidence certainly indicates that the anger kept rising. So what was the parliamentary response? Well, not content with what the government had done, the government announced a select committee to review the liquor licensing laws, and they recommended that Sydney's lockout law should be urgently scrapped on the grounds that Sydney's losing 16 billion of potential economic activity per annum by not taking full advantage of the nighttime economy. Never in the history of the world has a drop in crime made so many people unhappy. Right. And so on March 8th, 2021, we have to say farewell to the Sydney's lockout laws. Now, I was going to stop the presentation there, but you know, this is a serious problem and we need to look at it. In case you're not aware, 17%, according to the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, about 1 in 5 Australians every year is verbally abused by somebody under the influence of alcohol. More than 1 in 10 are put in fear by someone under the influence of alcohol. And about 5% are actually assaulted by someone under the influence of alcohol. So obviously, we've got to strike some sort of balance between public health and personal freedom. Well, the problems with the lockout laws from my perspective, and I think from a lot of other people's perspective, is that they're great for public health, safety and amenity, but it's obvious they can sometimes result in displacement. They're clearly bad for tourism. They harm businesses that don't sell alcohol. They harm licensed premises that sell alcohol responsibly, and they can provoke a big community backlash. So what would the public actually like to have happen? Well, the National Drug Strategy Household Survey actually asked the public about this. And surprise, surprise, 2/3 or more than 2/3 support stricter enforcement of liquor licensing laws. 61% support strict monitoring of the liquor licensing laws. 45%, nearly half of them, are more than happy to restrict late night trading. About 1/3 would support fewer liquor outlets, and a smaller proportion, 26%, would support fewer trading hours. So my personal view is that what we really need is something like this: hold the individual licensed premises accountable for enforcing the responsible service laws. That, after all, is what the previous government succeeded in doing in New South Wales. We got big drops in assault in those circumstances. Impose restrictions on trading hours of licensed premises that repeatedly breach the responsible service laws. Place limits on the density of licensed premises in an area, and allow local communities to set those limits. Now, I'm sorry if I've gone through all that too quickly. I was in a panic about not finishing in time for an adequate discussion, but that is the end of the story. Thank you.
Right. Don, you're a cheeky man, honestly. Look, if you could just stop share, great. Michael, if you can put your microphone on. That's incredibly interesting work and an incredibly important topic and a complex one. Michael, looking at what the history and what Don's results are looking like, where are you coming? Particularly, I suppose you're coming from a person who's got a clinical experience, public health experience. What's your observations on this?
Well, look, Don, thanks for your rapid coverage of a very complex topic, and your formula, which of course we will investigate further in due course and find that they're completely fictitious. But I think one of the interesting things in looking at this, and is the overlap between I think what's interesting in how you make it out is that the government did something which had an impact, a positive impact on assaults and that sort of stuff, but they got no political reward for it. And this is really, from a policy point of view, very important and instructive, and it's an area that we inhabit quite a lot. It's the same often when we advocate for increased taxes on alcohol, and politicians do not look favorably on the potential political gain for them from some of these things. So, but one of the bits I think you glossed over a bit that I think we should unpack in this discussion was the conflation of the restriction in trading hours with what really came out of nowhere, which were the lockout laws, which first of all have a negative connotation. They're negative simply by the word lock and out. And also they were convenient for the police because they took people off the streets for a period of time that was a very busy time before them for the police. But they put additional pressure on the hoteliers and also their capacity to perform within their keeping the peace within their establishment issue. So that the interesting thing about it was, by conflating those two, we lost some of the capacity to unpack where might our optimum opening and closing hours be, and how might we work with those? That in combination with density, I think, which is the other thing you mentioned, and how we would manage that. So actually, I think what is interesting is, from the point of view of future policy changes, if you do too much at one time, it's very hard to actually unpack it. And one of the ones I thought that we haven't ever made any sense out of, which is the capacity of the hospitality industry to kill its own business, which was when people criticized the King's Cross lockout laws. The question really is, did they actually, through their own publicity and promotional efforts, actually damage their own commercial interests?
Yes, well, look, I couldn't agree more with the last point you've just made. In fact, a classic example was the licensed premises known as Scruffy Murphy's, and it wasn't a nickname, that was the name they gave themselves. And it deliberately tried to appeal to a bunch of people who are not civilized or, rough and ready. And it was hardly surprising that the place had one of the highest levels of alcohol-related violence in the state at the time. I don't doubt that the liquor licensing or the licensed premises and their organising committees made some contribution to the problem, which they then demanded be solved. And that's always a problem when you're promoting alcohol. At the same time, I think it's not quite true to say that this is just a case of a government not being rewarded for doing good work. I think from the public standpoint, a lot of people were put out, especially people who are involved in the music industry, for example, and those who had nothing to do with selling alcohol, but simply provided, for example, food to people who come to King's Cross or the Sydney CBD. I thought, and this may sound like a party political comment, but it's not. I thought the advantage of the previous government's approach was that it was targeted at the places that were causing harm and left alone those for whom we had no evidence of causing harm. And it got quite a sizable reduction in assault, maybe not quite as large as the lockout laws, but it got it more generally across the state.
But wasn't one of the issues, and forgive me, you know this far better than me, that in the previous, before 2011, the density, the growth in density of establishments in the King's Cross area was fairly exponential?
Well, it's kind of you to say I know this. I don't actually know what was going on with the density of licensed premises in King's Cross. That's an important point and one we haven't looked at. But what I can say is that upward trend in assaults wasn't restricted to King's Cross or the CBD. It was happening across New South Wales. And I think from memory, alcohol consumption was rising rapidly between 2000 and 2008. So I don't think it was solely attributable to a change in density in King's Cross, but that may have been part of the King's Cross problem.
Well, we've got some questions that I'll throw to you, gentlemen. Malcolm Gillies has got a question, which is a statistical question. Did you consider autocorrelation, which is the existing trends? I think you did take under control for underlying trends in those.
Yeah, well, the autocorrelation was certainly looked after. I thought it might be a bridge too far to start talking about autocorrelation in a general seminar. But no, the work was carried out. The analytical work was largely carried out by time series specialist George Athanasopoulos, try and get my Greek right, down in Monash University. And, I think he did a very good job in dealing with all of those issues and in capturing the displacement.
Well, I've got a question from Meredith Crane. Thanks, Don. I'm interested in what extent the public response to reduced trading hours and entry laws was influenced by the media campaign you described and vocal industry groups. I mean, I suppose it's very hard to prove a direct relation, but what's your feeling about this?
Oh, my gut feeling is that's absolutely right. There was so much negative publicity pouring out about the lockout laws. I wouldn't have been surprised at all to see this big decline in public support. It's rather ironic, though, that had the then government or the government of the day actually looked at the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, they would have seen continuing increase in support for restrictions on liquor outlet density. That hasn't changed at all. In fact, there's more support now for that than there were way back in 2000. So a close look at public opinion, coupled with consultation with those in the know about how to reduce alcohol-related violence, I think would have resulted in a better set of policies.
Yeah. It seems to me that one thing that you're saying, and both of you, is one of the problems here, and correct me if I'm, is borders are a problem. When you have this area, this applies, this area, it doesn't. That it seems to me the alternative you're talking about, Don, is more the laws are the same everywhere. It's about enforcement of laws with that, but it's within a state jurisdiction. I mean, borders have always been a problem. You might remember, for those of us old enough to remember, bona fide travellers on Sundays. If you travelled 50 kilometres, you could have a drink in a pub. Great idea.
So I agree with you, Shane. The issue, and I think I'm sure Don agrees to this, that the laws need to be equally applied across all, and actually having a law in one locality that doesn't apply in other localities is problematic. I mean, there may be occasional circumstances where it's justified, but in general, you'd prefer to see a law that can operate uniformly across the entire jurisdiction.
I think that's
what you're saying, Don, essentially.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the thing to remember about this is that the lockout laws were triggered by the deaths of 2 young men. But if you step back from that, it wasn't as if King's Cross was the most violence-prone place in New South Wales. We've had huge problems of assault in other parts of New South Wales. There was never an argument for focusing solely on King's Cross. It's just an accident, if you like, or an accident, or tragic accident, that the deaths happened there. They could have happened anywhere. And I totally agree that if you're going to have a law like this, it needs to be applied uniformly and consistently across the state as a whole. In fact, it'd be great if the states and territories could get some agreement on this, because the Northern Territory has major problems in this area.
Yeah, these tragedies can occur everywhere. Look, we've got a question from Tony Brown. I'll get your view, Don, and maybe then you, Michael, who basically is referring to other areas, Newcastle, who had a similar intervention, as I understand it, and Queensland. Don, in your knowledge of these other jurisdictions, have their approaches, are they similar and similar trends, or are we looking at quite different environments?
Well, in Newcastle, the early results were certainly highly favourable. Hamilton was the adjacent suburb to compare it, and there was certainly no change in Hamilton, so you couldn't have attributed the drop in assault in Newcastle to something other than the lockout that occurred there. But a heck of a lot depends upon whether a business can reasonably set up in another location. Now, in the Newcastle experiment, there was never enough time for businesses, for example, to quit Newcastle CBD and go off to Hamilton or go off to some adjacent area. And that's why the long-term follow-up is so important. People keep saying, well, what was the effect of the lockout? Well, there are multiple effects over time, and you really need the long-term look. I know politicians can't wait for that, but you really need to look over the longer term to get a clear picture of what was going on. As far as Queensland's concerned, my understanding is they walked back from a lockout. They didn't actually implement it.
Right, they took a different approach.
Yeah.
Actually, Michael, I might throw this to you because it follows on from everything that's been said. And one of our attendees has said, how should policymakers make the choice between public health harms, which is very much a lot of our focus, and the other, like economic and social harms? How does one go about achieving public health and economic? We see this in other aspects of health as well, obviously.
Well, I think Don described it quite well in a way, is that partly the thing one is doing is actually measuring public sentiment, having consultation with the public around some of the options and seeing which ones are more and less acceptable. I mean, this is what politicians do all the time. There's sometimes tough decisions have to be made that aren't favorable, but in general, you would say you want to enact legislation that will garner appropriate political and public support that will sustain its implementation. And it's not impossible to do that, but there is I think the issue of public consultation and that whole process of trying to figure out what are your best options is quite important. I mean, you know, seatbelts are a great example of something that when introduced might have encountered resistance, but over time, the support and strength of support for them has grown considerably.
And possibly random breath testing is another example.
Random breath. And they're examples of things where restrictions in freedom are entailed in it, but when enacted in a way and where there's ongoing evaluation of the impact, and particularly if there's negative impacts, that the strategy is modified to, you know, to minimize those negative impacts, whatever they be. And I think that clearly has to be done around, you know, the for instance, the data on the duration of the alcohol licensing hours is actually quite complex. And my own view is that the choice of 3 o'clock is quite a good target around the time. You might have gone for 2 a.m. in terms of where the assaults begin to go up. And they're things you can actually modify over time. And they make a significant difference to assaults on the street and assaults in the premises and assaults in the community.
Yeah, yeah. Don, did you have anything to add to that in terms of?
No, I totally agree with what Michael's just said. I think, I mean, these are difficult issues, but you can never avoid having to balance competing interests here. Much as we all focus ourselves on the public health interests, you can't make progress on the public health interests if you can't bring the public with you. So you really need to weave in what's effective with what's going to be supported, or it'll all come undone like it did with the lockout laws.
I mean, for instance, Shane, I at the time of the lockout laws, I thought one of the, what I would say would be logistically inept things was beginning to interfere with the type of drink people could have at different times of the evening.
Right.
If you wanted to look at something where you say, well, that's really hard to police and all of those things, and it's going to be very unpopular because you're interfering with sort of normal social behavior. And
well, we've got one of the attendees has got an observation that's similar to that. I think the recommendations are going about densities, etc., be enforced, given they're largely self-regulated. So in a case like that, it's very much relying on self-regulation within a venue, is it not?
Well, for what I know about it, and I confess not being totally, but my understanding is that one of the issues was there was a push on small venues and the growth of small venues, but it wasn't actually possible to manage what size of a group went into these small venues. Okay. So it resulted in a very bigger growth in the volume of drinkers in some localities than the original intention was, like the Tony Blair cafe culture type thing. We'll have civilized Barcelona style bars at 3 a.m. with people drinking cups of coffee. And clearly that wasn't the impact. The impact was slews of cider and sort of tequila shots at 3 a.m. with a lot of gross intoxication.
Yeah. Look, I've got a question here. It's a topic I wanted to get onto, and I'll throw it to you, Don, because I think Adam Finkelstein's talking about this, and I was thinking about home deliveries in particular, but there are other aspects. Said, was there any increase in domestic violence that was alcohol related during the lockout? I mean, or is that we didn't look at that, or?
Well, we didn't look at domestic assault. With the benefit of hindsight, we probably should have. There wasn't, at the time we completed the studies when I was at the Bureau, there wasn't any sign of an increase or decrease in domestic assault. It was something which, and when the drop occurred for non-domestic assault, I can vividly remember the Minister for Women saying at the time, if only we could get a drop in domestic assault of the same magnitude.
Yes.
You'd have to talk to the Bureau of Crime Statistics to get a sense of what's happened since then. I haven't been working on that problem of late. But just one other point I should make. It's really important to remember that the responsible service laws were enacted a long time ago, but they were never complied with. I mean, Neil Donnelly did a series of studies surveying drinkers and found there was just flagrant ignorance or flagrant non-enforcement of those orders. It was only when the Department of Liquor, Gaming and Racing, I think as it now is, started to enforce those laws and police took it seriously that we started to get any real traction on assault. So the enforcement process is often underestimated, and it's really important to setting both the opportunities for getting drunk and the general social mores surrounding drunk behaviour.
Yeah. I'll get back onto that. So, Alyssa Harwood said, great talk, Don. Just wondering, are you able to comment on the targeted 3 strikes scheme? And this, I'm not familiar with
So the idea behind the 3 strike scheme was that it was an adaptation of the previous Labor government's policy. The idea was that if a licensed premises commits 3 defined breaches of the responsible service laws, they would then get those restrictions. But what happened was nobody, to my knowledge, or almost nobody, actually collected 3 strikes. So it was a sort of toothless tiger approach to enforcement of responsible service. The naming and shaming worked a treat. When the top 48 licensed premises in terms of violence were identified, those 48 premises had a big reduction in assault. The other licensed premises in the state didn't get any reduction. And in case you're thinking that's because they stopped reporting it, we checked whether or not the person reporting the assault had changed, and no change had occurred in who was reporting it. So, I mean, naming and shaming can be a very effective way of dealing with bad behaviour on the part of business.
Yeah. Michael, I've got a question I'll throw to you, because you've worked not only in public health, we've actually sat on committees, the government committees in the UK and here. And it's talking about the public consultation offer is conflicting with the pressures on government from the alcohol industry. And of course, there is, substantial money obtained from taxes on alcohol. How does this affect the process in your experience?
Well, I think we understand that the alcohol industry is a very big industry. It's a very important industry as part of the overall hospitality and entertainment industry. So anything of that size will carry substantial weight. I think one of the things that in some of the dialogue we need to have, it's a bit like the food industry. There needs to be far greater focus on what role and responsibility those industries also have around health dimensions of their products. And as with the discussion in the context of alcohol as no ordinary commodity, being clear in the policy discussion that it can't be treated simply like any other product. It's not like a pack of biscuits. So that actually you end up having a framework for this discussion that incorporates the public health dimension and makes sure that the conflicting or competing interests are managed in a way that I don't think to date we've managed it very well.
Don, when you're of course you were providing statistics directly to government on these sensitive issues, did you have any feelings about the conflicting, the pressures on ministers and government bodies that they were under in dealing with your work, for example?
Well, if that's a polite way of asking whether I got any blowback from government, the answer is no. No, I mean, I think they were extremely worried about the response, but by the time we were talking about a massive negative reaction, then it was really a matter of pure politics. It had nothing to do with the stats. The only concern we had expressed was one from an academic in Sydney University who accused us of deliberately misplacing assaults which belong to King's Cross as if they're in the Sydney CBD. And that's why I included that affected zone analysis to show that you got a general reduction in assault in the combined area, even if you're not 100% convinced it happened in the CBD or the King's Cross.
Yeah.
But that was the only criticism of the work that I've encountered so far. I think the government was undoubtedly shocked because, you know, you're staring at a huge reduction in assault and everybody's attacking left, right and centre.
Yeah, yeah. Just Tony Brown's issue has made a comment here about Queensland. There's been a couple of comments about Queensland. Basically saying, and Queensland had no curfew, but modest reduction in trading. And so that argue that it was a dominant factor. It sounds like Queensland did go us down a slightly different route of restriction than we did, at least in central Sydney. Yeah,
I mean, look, it's been known for a very long time. I think Chana Secrecies and Tim Stockwell were among the first to show that trading hours matter. And that's been confirmed in numerous studies since. And density and trading hours. Sure.
Particularly trading hours.
Yeah. I think, though, what hadn't been worked through was what happens when you take a really big night spot and simply shut it down after a certain period of time without any consultation or without a lot of warning. And, you know, it used to be assumed, and I assumed, that displacement was a rarity. And usually if it occurred, it was never as big as the reduction that you got. And that's the way it looked in the early stages of the lockout. But I now think that you've really got to think about the mechanisms that generate displacement. And if they involve starting new businesses or creating new business opportunities, it can be a long time before the counteracting effect occurs.
I mean, in terms of one bit of history, in terms of when random breath testing was introduced, there was enormous opposition. And there was an argument from rural parliamentarians that there should be different levels of acceptable alcohol concentrations in urban and non-urban areas.
Yeah.
Like 0.05, 0.08. This is a similar thing, but this was again regarded as completely unenforceable, and that one should have the same jurisdiction, whether that be on hours, whether that be on density, across a jurisdiction. I think your point that it would be good to get it across all Australian jurisdiction is valid, but I look at railway gauges and I'm not 100% certain I'll be alive when this happens.
Well, you may be right. When I said uniform laws, I really meant a uniform approach. I don't think it's feasible. I mean, you're going to have a uniform approach to blood alcohol level. You wouldn't necessarily have a uniform approach to density, because what the situation in Burke or Broken Hill is very different to the situation in Blacktown or you know, Balmain.
Yes. It's anonymous attendees talking about culture. Bands could start earlier. I think 6 p.m. is good enough for me. I'm in bed by the time they start.
Right.
I do think, though, that claim that the music industry was affected by the lockout laws is a bit of a furphy, because I think that there's not many live music events that were starting after midnight, and I've always thought that was didn't really stack up.
Yeah,
I didn't know you had such a late life, Michael.
There you go. With any luck, Dan.
I just got another comment from Richard about, again, well, actually, this is an interesting comment. Richard's got a comment here that's government saying, talking about one thing we haven't discussed is minimum price of drinks. That's more broad social policy than what we're talking here.
Yeah.
Michael, this goes back to volumetric taxation argument, and I'll get you, Michael, because you're familiar with this. I mean, and the UK's, my understanding, has gone down that route, has it not?
Well, to Scotland in particular,
yes.
Basically, it was to do with the fact that the volumetric taxing, while seen as the most even approach to it, seemed to be politically unacceptable
by which we mean that the tax was relative to the alcohol concentration in a drink.
So then the move came to basically find a compromise strategy, and the compromise strategy was minimum unit pricing. And the minimum unit pricing actually favors the licensed premises, because it actually increases the expense of takeaway alcohol. And
Right.
one of the concerns over time, and it would be a concern now in the next year or so, where if cost of living is going up, that people don't go to licensed premises, they don't go out and socialize, but they buy the alcohol and drink it at home.
Yeah.
There's pretty good evidence, particularly from the Scottish, done with the Sheffield group, of the impact of minimum unit pricing in relation to impacts on levels of drinking and harms around it, I think. But again, it's a complex thing, because one of the complexities of minimum unit pricing is some of the profits go direct to the traders, and it isn't like where money is collected that then can go into other areas of government revenue. So strategies that don't increase government revenue may not be too exciting for government.
Yeah. Did you have any views on those sorts of issues, taxation, on in terms of, I suppose that's broader. We're not talking local areas here. We're talking about a broad public health intervention.
Well, look, in general, price mechanisms are a very effective way of dealing with demand for potentially dangerous substances, whether they be illicit drugs or alcohol or tobacco. I agree totally with Michael. The only thing I'd say is that I far prefer a volumetric tax approach, for the reason Michael's given, than to having minimum unit pricing. I mean, the harmful part of alcohol is the alcohol. That's the bit that causes the trouble. Yeah. So obviously you'd want to have a tax that's proportional to the harm that's being done by the substance.
The taxation system at the moment, say in New South Wales, where we're speaking from, it's not volumetric. Let's just take beer, spirits, and wine. What's the approach to those three, even though they've got different level concentrations?
Well, Michael would know that better than I do.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things in Australia, you'll be surprised to hear that the wine industry has a special consideration, and it's one of the other reasons why there isn't a keenness on a volumetric thing, because there's a sort of tendency to have more tax on the spirits than on some of the wines, and it's not very well figured out. And there's been a lot of criticism. I think it was Ken Henry's. There was a major review where there was a major critique, and that this is now must be over 10 years ago, of the volumetric taxation. There was a commitment to do something about it, but it really hasn't come to anything. And it isn't unusual to Australia. The same problems have occurred in Europe and in the UK, if we count it as slightly apart from Europe. But it's always been a problem of the countries who dominate in certain parts of the alcohol industry try to tweak the thing in favor of their product, and it's a type of protection type thing. So you facilitate the price of your own product, and you heap the tax on the imported competitor products. I mean, that's the oldest trick in the book.
Yeah.
All right. I think alcohol policy is sorted for the next 50 years after that. Thank you, Don. Excellent presentation. A really important issue and really important work. And Michael, for your excellent observations. Just before we leave, I'll get Katie, if you could please put up the slide on our upcoming events, so that we can see what's coming up in the next week or two, next few weeks. It's the last one of the month. On the 14th of July, we've got Crystal McDonald, who's doing her PhD under Don's supervision on the factors influencing mental health diversion in the New South Wales local courts. That'll be fantastic. And then the following week, on the 21st, we've got Emeritus Professor Wayne Hall, the University of Queensland, talking about implications of the revival of therapeutic research on psychedelic drugs, which is going to be incredibly interesting. And we're launching an NDARC monograph on that day on this work. And I'll remind you all that the registration is now open for the 2022 NDARC Symposium, Tuesday 20 and Wednesday 21 September. please register. It's free, and it's always excellent. So look, I just want to thank our panel, our speaker John, our panelists Michael, and I'd really like to thank you, the audience, for your attention for this and your excellent observations in Q&A. And I wish you all an excellent afternoon and evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.